Well, hello. Today we are going to talk about the Middle Passage. So what are we looking at here? This is, of course, the world. The Middle Passage deals with the slave trade between Africa over here and America over here. And of course it involves England, which is right there. My stylus doesn't work. Try it again. There it is. There's England. It's a mustard color. This unit has two objectives. Well, two things to really consider. Two questions. The first one is, why was slavery introduced to the colonies? This is actually a good question, considering slave labor really was not used in Europe, especially not in England. So what was it about English people in the New World that made them say, we should start using slaves? Second question is, how did the institution of slavery influence European and African life in the colonies? When we think about slavery in the United States, we tend to think of these great big old houses like this. These are called plantations. Is that going to fit? Plantation. And again, it's the standard kind of old school southern big huge house, big farm, tobacco or cotton. Well, these did exist and they came along later, but the period that we're really dealing with is the beginning of the colonies. So 1607 Jamestown was founded, and in 1619 you really started to see an importation of African slaves. So these big plantations weren't built yet, but this is how it all started. So again, looking at a map, you got Europe over here. Let's go green. So here's Europe, specifically England right there. And they got in their boats and they're like, okay, let's go down here. This is the West African coast. Now, slavery has existed in Africa forever, and unfortunately it continues to exist there today. And at this time period, there was an active slave trade there in the yellow area, which is the west coast of Africa. So slave traders would go to Africa, pick up a group of slaves, then bring them over here across the Atlantic, stopping sometimes in the Caribbean or just going straight to the colonies. So here's the English colonies right there. And of course, what did we say this was called? The Middle Passage. Look at that. That looks great. And that's the Middle Passage right there. Why do you think it's called that? It goes across the middle of the Atlantic. Now let's take a second to look at the conditions of, conditions on the slave ships. The slave traders, they really had two competing ideas, quantity or quality. And what I mean by that is, quality would mean a ship with just a few slaves on it would come over and pretty much every slave would survive and you'd sell them once you got to the New World. Now quantity is where they would pack people in, and what you're looking at here is, these are people. This is a diagram of a slave ship. It would actually divide up the decks and basically just stack shoulder to shoulder laying down. Here's a picture of what it might have looked like. The quantity method was, a lot of people are going to die, but you get a lot more in general on the when you get to the New World. Now the conditions here are thankfully pretty much unimaginable to us today, because it would get to be over 110 degrees in the holds of the ship. The people, as you can see, they're laying down, they're shackled in position, they're shoulder to shoulder. You didn't get to get up to go to the bathroom. You also probably had a lot of people growing increasingly ill and sick from the heat, the seasickness, and the stench. This would have been really a terrible place to be. The only exercise was usually for 1 hour a day maybe. They would bring the slaves up on top of the deck and let them walk around a little bit and then send them back below. Conditions were so bad they had to guard against the slaves jumping off of the ship into the ocean. So what were the Europeans looking for? Well, lots of cheap land, and there in the New World, there it was. I mean, they got here. There's this beautiful property. No one owns it. No one's living here. Well, people are, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands of Indians, but nobody with a deed or a mortgage lives here. So, to the European way of thinking, this means all this land is up for grabs. So the problem is, how do we farm it? How do we get people to work it? And initially, they started with indentured servants. These are people who said, hey, look, if you'll pay for me to go to the New World, because I'm really poor, if you pay for it, I'll work for you for, they'd sign a contract, 7 to 10 years, something like that. And these people usually came from England or Ireland. So initially, you got, here's England again, right there. There's Scotland, and there's Ireland. So you had English-speaking peoples at first going over. But the thing was, once their indenture was over, there was all this land, and even the poorest person could usually get a farm if they were European. 75% of white males in the New World were property owners. So that creates a constant labor shortage. Which brings us back, of course, to the slave trade. So over in the New World, they've paid off their debt. Now what? Permanent replaceable labor, which takes the form of slaves. So, again, we create the trade route. We go across the what? The Middle Passage, and drop off slaves here in the New World. And then the English would return with raw materials, trees, tobacco, stuff like that, back to England. So as a result, what you see is in the areas of the New World that are really good for growing big crops like the South right here, you see the birth of an agricultural slave society. Agricultural, that's a fancy word which means farming. This slavery basically lasts from 1619 till 1861, which is the outset of the Civil War. Because of the South's use of slaves and that division that kind of forms right there, where you get good farming down here and not so good up here, it's going to sow the seeds which will continue to divide the country until eventually war. So let's review. Number 1, why was slavery introduced into the colonies? Profitable farming and labor shortages. That's what encouraged the Europeans to start the practice. And our second question, how did the institution of slavery influence European and African life in the colonies? Well, first, southern colonies developed into agricultural slave societies. And second, it set in motion the division that led to the Civil War. This is me, and this is a Lego spaceship I built. Thank you, and good day.